Good evening, and welcome to today's meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California. You can find us at commonwealthclub.org on Facebook and Twitter, and on the club's YouTube channel. I'm Dennis Wu, past chair of the Commonwealth Club Board of Governors, a member of the Committee of 100's Board of Directors, and your chair for today's program. This program is being held in association with the Committee of 100. Established in 1990 as a nonprofit organization, the Committee of 100 has a high legacy of harnessing the power of its membership, distinguished membership, to address significant complex issues pertaining to Americans of Chinese descent and U.S.-China relations. And now, I'm pleased to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Graham Allison, former Assistant Secretary of Defense, Director of Harvard University Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and author of the new book, Destined for War: Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? Dr. Allison is a leading scholar of U.S. national security and defense policy. He was the founding dean of the Harvard Kennedy School, leading it from 1977 to 1989, when he led the expansion of a small program that became a major professional school with a significant impact on world government and public policy in the U.S. Dr. Allison also served as special advisor to the Secretary of Defense under President Reagan and as Assistant Secretary of Defense under President Bill Clinton. He has twice been awarded the Department of Defense highest civilian award, the Distinguished Public Service Medal. Today, he'll discuss whether China and the U.S. are headed towards war, and if so, whether conflict can be avoided. We're very pleased that Dr. Allison will be in conversation with the Honorable Ellen Tauscher, former U.S. Congressional Representative for California's 10th District, former Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security under President Obama, and a member of the Commonwealth Club's Board of Governors. Please welcome Graham Allison and Ellen Tauscher.
Thank you, Dennis. It's great to be here at the Commonwealth Club, and thank you, the Committee of 100, for co-sponsoring today. Hello, Graham.
Hello.
Have we known each other 20 years? Probably about that.
At least.
I first met Graham when I went to Congress about 20 years ago. I represented, as you might remember, the 10th Congressional District, which was Walnut Creek, and included the two nuclear weapons labs in Livermore. And Graham is a great expert on many things, including nuclear weapons policy. So he came to see me in the first few weeks that I was in the House of Representatives in January of '97. And it was a fast friendship, and you've been an advisor and a counselor to me for all these years, and I'm so proud of you. And so he's written this great book, Destined for War: Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? Thucydides. You couldn't have picked Homer or somebody with an easier name to deal with? So why don't we talk about the book? It's really terrific. I recommend it to all of you. I've actually gotten rid of a pile of stickies. I have a lot of questions for you, but I want the audience to get to some questions. So why don't you talk to us about Thucydides' Trap, and why Thucydides is such a cool guy, and why we should all read about the Peloponnesian War, and then tell us why this is an important conversation to have about the relationship between the United States and China.
Well, thank you. And first let me say how pleased I am and what a privilege it is to be back here at the Commonwealth Club, and then especially with Ellen Tauscher, who's one of the great American public servants. I was fortunate to have good fortune to know her really pretty soon after she came to Congress. I didn't know her before. She was a great stalwart in Congress for good sense on all issues that had to do with the agenda that I was concerned about, nuclear weapons and non-proliferation, and took a leadership role in that space and about nuclear security. And then when she became Undersecretary for Arms Control at the State Department under Secretary Clinton, she kindly invited me to join her advisory board, which I did with enthusiasm. So I'm a big Ellen Tauscher fan, and so this is a double treat for me.
Thank you.
Thucydides is a mouthful, and multisyllabic. But for San Francisco, this is not hard. So actually, we're going to say in unison here at least 3 times so everybody feels comfortable. Thucydides, Thucydides, Thucydides. So if you want just a hoot to go to the Thucydides Trap website that's put up in conjunction with the book, and there's a little thing called Look Who's Talking About Thucydides, and you'll see various people mashing it by Thucydides, Thucydides, whatever. The answer, Thucydides. This is not hard. So who was Thucydides? Thucydides was the father and founder of history as we know it. So the first bit of recorded history written to tell it as it really was, to get the facts straight, was a book that Thucydides wrote on the Peloponnesian War that you can go and download for free. It's a great book, great read. And Thucydides wrote about the great war that basically destroyed the 2 leading city-states of classical Greece. And he wrote quite famously one line that said, "It was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made the war inevitable." So here you had these 2 great city-states in classical Greece. They had a war at the end of which they were both exhausted. And there was a great puzzle. How did this happen? Why did this happen? And various people had various theories of the case. And Thucydides tells us in his book, well, people say this, and people say that, and people say that. But let me take you to the heart of the matter. The heart of the matter was this structural dynamic that occurs when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power. So that's the concept, Thucydides' trap. When a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power. Now the storyline, is literally is as old as history itself. And it's repeated itself regularly over the course of history. So in this book, what I do is, first I was trying to understand what's happening in the relationship between the US and China. And eventually, I'm not a China expert. I try to be a national security student, an expert, and I'm interested and have been interested for my whole professional career in American foreign policy and foreign policy making. But I stumble across this thinking, well, wait a minute. Beneath every day, there's noise and news about what's happening with China. So just tonight, when I was writing here, North Korea has launched 4 more missiles. Mm-hmm. And tomorrow there'll be a story about, as it was last week, China becomes Germany's #1 trading partner. And tomorrow there'll be another story about China doing this or China. So beneath the noise and news of the day or the week or the month, is there something that we could see that would help us clarify this picture? And I think that there is, and I think that concept is a rising power threatening to displace a ruling power. That's the main dynamic of the story. And once you sort of look at it through that lens, a lot of other pieces begin to make sense. So in the book, I look at the last 500 years of history. I find 16 cases when a rising power threatened to displace a ruling power. In 12 of the cases, the outcome was war. In 4 of the cases, the outcome was not war.
That's not a very good average. 12 wars and 4 not wars, that's
Right.
not a very good average.
No. And I say in the book that business as usual in this case will likely produce history as usual. And a war between the US and China would be catastrophic, as everybody knows. So only those who refuse to study history are condemned to repeat it.
George Santana.
So no reason why we have to make the same mistakes over again. Now, of course, the mistakes have often been made over the centuries, and sometimes human beings are dumb and make the same mistakes over and over, but we're not required to.
Right, but Graham, you say that in the book very early on that while war may be possible, it is not inevitable.
Not inevitable.
Not inevitable, but that it is a very sticky wicket
Right.
because there are so many dynamics that make both miscalculations and mistakes possible. Competition is what competition is. It causes people to not necessarily be friendly, not necessarily sit down and think about what the other person is thinking about, understand a strategy to deal with that. Can you talk a little bit about what the United States and China should and must be doing so that war is not inevitable?
So, yes, and let me just take what you said and expand on it just a little bit, because in a very nice capsule, you captured an important part of what this picture is. So, Thucydides' big idea is that the rising power threatening to displace the ruling power, what happens under those circumstances? So this actually, the pattern of behavior is not that strange as you were suggesting. What happens when a upstart, let's take Uber or Google or Apple, any upstart, threatens to displace an incumbent? Look at the dynamic. Or maybe even in a family, when a kid that's shorter all of a sudden sprouts and is now taller than the other kid that used to be the tallest kid. Now, what happens at the dinner table conversation? The taller one starts to talk a little more because I've gotten bigger, I've gotten stronger. My interests deserve more weight. I deserve more say. I should have more sway. The current arrangements that we have are probably a little confining.
You're not the boss of me.
And nobody consulted me when they allocated the bedrooms, to start with. And now I'm bigger, and I think I probably need a little more space. I need to adjust. So this is a human pattern. This is a pattern in corporations. In Thucydides' case, he's writing to us about nation states, but it gets repeated. So it's not, we can intuit what's going on. And for the ruling power, it's quite plausible that it looks and says, wait a minute, the situation is great. I mean, how have you had an environment in which you had a chance to grow up and to become stronger and to become bigger? It's because I helped provide an environment for you. You should be grateful. And this idea you need to adjust and to change things, no, the way things are is stable, it's fine. So that creates, just as Ellen said, a tension, a structural, inherent, inescapable structural stress. So you can't avoid that. In those conditions, each party's perception of the other party becomes cloudy, and misperceptions are exaggerated. So I'm trying to be benign. I'm actually trying to be helpful. But you look at me and you say, I think he has an ulterior motive. Because I know he's actually rising, and ultimately he wants to be on top.
Right.
Okay? And you behave in a way that's actually quite helpful to me, but I don't give you the benefit of the doubt. So misperceptions grow greatly. And then most importantly, and this is Thucydides' story, the two parties don't decide now's a good time for a war. So in my 16 cases, there are very few in which somebody wanted a war. What happens is you have this structural stress, and now a third party's action that would otherwise be incidental or inconsequential or easily manageable triggers a reaction by one of the parties, which is then misperceived by the other party, and now things are being compounded with actions and reactions, and to the end of that path, the parties find themselves in a war that they didn't even want to go to, and they didn't mean to go to, and often that if they had thought about it, they wouldn't have gone to, and afterwards they regret having gone to, but nonetheless, that's where they get to.
So Lee Kuan Yew, who's the father of Singapore, a great study of history and understanding, obviously Asian, living in that environment, gone through the Second World War, creates Singapore as a nation state, very strong. He said, that the balance of power always was to the advantage of military powers. That was the old paradigm. The new paradigm is military power and economic power, both of which China has. Actually, China will pass the United States, has passed on some things, but will pass generally very soon. Talk a little bit about the new tectonic plates that cause this banging, and obviously that adds a new dimension to the avoidance of war when you have something else that could trigger a sense of jealousy and a sense of worry about the rise of someone else. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure. So to remember, and I like you for citing, so Lee Kuan Yew was not only the founder of Singapore, who built a rock into a megapolis that's now per capita income higher than the U.S. So an amazing story itself. But in any case, he was one of the world's great strategists, and he was certainly the world's premier China watcher, partly because he lives right there next door, and Singapore survives at the forbearance of China. So he had a big reason to pay a lot of attention to China, but even more importantly, because every Chinese leader, starting with Deng Xiaoping, when China decided to move to the market, came to him for advice. So he studied China because they were studying him. People came to Singapore not for him to talk to, but because they wanted to ask him questions. So Singapore was like a little bit of a model. And every one of these Chinese leaders, including Xi Jinping, called him mentor, their teacher. So he looked at the situation and he said, notice, most people now, most of the time in the 21st century, live with their economics more than with military. Military that produce wars and the use of military force is a rare and exceptional case. Economics is day-to-day where parties live. So if and as China becomes a larger economy, and even as it has become already the largest economy in the world, okay? As it becomes the dominant trading partner with every one of the states in Asia, and in time with every state in the world. I mean, now with Germany, just last week. What happens is basically the economic balance of power shifts, and it used to be that the Americans were the principal place you went for buying or selling or investing or whatever. Now, more and more China is the place that matters most to the economy of Singapore or to the Philippines.
Because that
or to
curries
South Korea.
favor, and that causes people to want to be friendly.
Right, and because, I mean, as Hillary Clinton said, whom you worked for when she first went to China, she says, well, remind me, how do I argue with my banker?
Yeah.
You know, they're holding $2 trillion.
Or my landlord.
$2 trillion worth of our debt, because that's how we make up the difference between how much we spend and how much we take in. So basically, in the Chinese case, because they've come to have a more and more dominant economic position, and because they're quite willing to use this economic power to squeeze countries when they don't behave the way China would like for them to behave. Again, in the book, I have a description from Lee Kuan Yew about the question. I asked him, so how will China behave when it becomes number one? And he would always have this way in which, when he thought you would ask a dumb question, he wouldn't say that, but his eyes would go wider, you know, like, what? And so he said, here in Singapore, we see this already today. The Chinese tell us we are not a hegemon. All states, big or small, are equal. But when we do something they don't like, they say, you have made 1.4 billion people unhappy. Know your place. And we adapt or adjust. When the Philippines was having a fuss with China over islands, all of a sudden the main export from the Philippines to China, bananas, got stuck on the dock, and they told them they're going to sit there until they rot. That's it. When the Norwegians, actually, the Norwegian government had nothing to do with this. The Norwegian Nobel Prize Committee awarded a Nobel Prize to a dissident in China. The Chinese said, you can't do this. This guy's a dissident. We don't allow that. The Norwegian government said, we're not in charge of this. This is an independent organization. They said, okay. And China had been the #1 market for salmon for Norway, which is one of their biggest exports. The next week, they was zero. And the Norwegians, after 4 years of complaining, finally got back on their knees and groveled enough that the Chinese said, okay, we've punished you enough. You can begin to sell a little bit more salmon. So I would say the economic balance of power is we can see it everywhere. And now if you're in the American context, as we heard in the campaign, I mean, candidate Trump basically focused on China as the source of all of our economic problems. And while that was an exaggeration, it is the case that in many, many areas, China is now displacing the U.S. in domains that we were previously dominant.
So there's a lot of bad news there in the sense that there's a lot of rivalry and a lot of competition and a little banging. But I think it's important that you talk about, in the book you say, one does not have to stretch too far to answer affirmatively that there are 4 mega threats that loom above all: nuclear Armageddon, nuclear anarchy, global terrorism, especially as threatened by Islamic jihadism, and climate change. In confronting each of these, the vital natural interests of the two powers share are much greater than those that divide them. So there are areas where the United States and China, because of both their economic and military positions, could work together. I'm not too sure about climate change anymore after last week, but certainly they can work with Governor Brown, who was there talking to the
Absolutely.
Xi Jinping. But talk about the fact that this isn't all bad news, that there's a way for us to aggressively try to balance some of these hegemonic issues with things to work on.
Well, that's a great point. So let me come at it at a little strange angle that'll seem strange, but I'll get precisely to the point. In the class I teach at Harvard, which I've taught for many, many years, one device I use for helping people get the picture is I say, imagine that there were adult supervision in international affairs. Now, of course, we know there's not. International affairs is a jungle. So there's nobody on top of Trump or Xi Jinping. They can do what they want. Okay? But let's just imagine there were adult supervision so that when there's a spat in the schoolyard, somebody comes and says, hey, wait a minute, So I often imagine that there was a Martian strategist who's this adult supervisor. And I could imagine she drops in on the summit at Mar-a-Lago between Xi and Trump. And she says, guys, sit down just for a second. I have a few points to make. Okay? Now, what might she have told them? She would say, first, think about your vital interests first. What is essential for your survival and well-being? Not all the other things that you might be vivid, you might be concerned about. No, what's vital? So first, if you end up in a war that becomes a nuclear war, you'll succeed in killing all of each other. That's a bad idea. Okay? So it doesn't take much sense to get that one. So have you got it? And say, well, think of it again. I even say in the book, the grotesque image, but imagine you wake up one day, Ellen and I, and we both have our heads, we both have our arms and legs, but somehow in the night, our backbones and our respiratory systems have been fused, and we're Siamese twins. So then, however much of a jerk I am, however demonic I become, however dangerous, every time she gets ready to strangle me, she's going to look and say, wait a minute, that's a good idea. He deserves to be strangled. I would like to strangle him, but if I do, I'm committing suicide. So this is not a good idea. Okay? So that was a part of the bedrock in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. That's bedrock here. And it's hard to remember, but that could happen. So if that could happen, then we have a huge shared common interest. Okay? That's number one. Number two, look at the economics of the U.S. and China. These two economies are almost fully entangled. Basically, if there were a war between U.S. and China, there would be no goods in Walmart. And the Chinese factories would be producing a lot of stuff that they don't have to. And besides, where would we get our loans
Right.
to make up our deficit? So that's not a good idea. So that's the second thing. Third, in the climate space, not everybody in the country agrees, obviously after last week, but most people who have looked at this in a serious way agree that the current pattern of use of energy that we all participate in will emit enough greenhouse gases to make the climate uninhabitable or difficult to inhabit for our great-great-great-grandchildren 100 years from now. So that's an existential threat to our country if it should come to be uninhabitable. Okay? So now, if the U.S. were to do everything conceivable that it could do, and China just kept doing what it's currently doing, is there any solution to the problem? No, because greenhouse gases go into the same bathtub that we both share. It's just one atmosphere for everybody. And similarly, if they did everything they could do and we keep doing just what we're doing, is there a solution? No. So that's either a problem that the two parties would work together to solve or that they will fail to solve. So I think she would say to the leaders of the two countries, guys, this is a lot to build on. There's quite a lot here. In fact, I would just say one more thing that I say in the conclusion of the book. I think the other point she would say to the two parties is, I even have another idea for you. I'm just telling you first about your international interests. But if you were thinking about your own country and its well-being, each of you have a serious problem that happens is just within your own border, not between the two of you, just within your own border. And that problem is the question of whether you can govern yourself. And one of you has a dysfunctional democracy, and if it can't do better than it's been doing lately, it's not really going to matter the rest of the story. And the other one is trying to rebuild an autocracy in an environment in which now you have an open economy and you have smartphones where people can get a lot of information. So that's not going to make it either. So you got a lot of work to do at home. So I would say there's more than enough that you could imagine people building on if we could be adult. Yeah.
Right. And you say that there are 4 core ideas, and you've effectively gone through 2 of them: clarify vital interest and make domestic challenges central to your thinking. But you also say that in the U.S. we have to do some hard thinking and some hard work. And part of it is to do strategy, and the other is to understand China.
Right.
And I wouldn't say that I think that the American people are great people, but I don't think we necessarily spend a whole lot of time thinking about the other guy. And so the doing strategy and understanding China seem to have a duality to them. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So Ellen is a great reader, and it's actually, you kind of get the nuggets. So this is like the comfy guide, the reader's guide, that you can read the short version here. So let me save strategy just for a second. So I think the understanding China. Unless you have been following China carefully, I don't think you get what's happening in China. It's what's happened. So I have, I think, a good chapter in the book, as good a 20-page or 25-page summary you could get on what's actually happened. So basically, in our lifetime, in our professional lifetimes, just in one generation, a country that did not appear on any international league table has leaped to a position of rivalry, or even supremacy, in most every arena. So this is just a country that is, when Ronald Reagan was elected president, China's GDP was 10% of the American GDP. In 2014, the big news from the IMF World Bank meeting is China has now the largest economy in the world. And that's what CIA and the IMF both say, and that's what I say in the book. And by 2024, in the current trend line, China is going to be half again larger. So in the book, I give you this chart that, in an abbreviated version, that I give to my students at Harvard. And it says, when could China become number 1? And I have 26 indicators. And they start with manufacture of automobiles, manufacture of smartphones, manufacture of robots, fastest computers, artificial intelligence, number of billionaires, 26. And I asked kids, when could China become number one? So they have to fill in the blanks. 2024, 2040, 2050, not in my lifetime for the various ones. Then I give them the second chart, and it says already. So every one of these, I give them the date that this already happened. They can't believe this. We know that America, USA, means number one. I mean, I've said in other settings, I'm a red-blooded American, actually a red-necked American. I come from North Carolina. I know somewhere it is written, either in the Bible or in the Constitution or somewhere, that says USA means number one. Okay? So the idea that some other country could be bigger and stronger than we are, no, no, no. And as Lee Kuan Yew said, and he would say this repeatedly, you Americans will simply not accept the reality of what's actually happening. And so in that chapter, I think, have a nice line from the former president of the Czech Republic, Václav Havel, and he said, who says, all this has happened so fast, you haven't had time yet to be astonished.
Right. And isn't some of this also a failure of imagination, to a certain extent, that things are happening now so quickly that it's difficult to understand exactly what has happened, but you've got to react. And that's why it's so important to have at least a passingly good relationship, so that misunderstanding doesn't creep in and that you are completely at odds with each other when you need each other the most.
Absolutely.
Something else happens, like North Korea.
And but if your mindset is so firmly fixed that you can't see what your eyes are, observing, but you're not processing it. So China cannot have a larger economy than the U.S. No, I mean that can't be. So you can still read in the paper almost every day, if you look at your news, almost all American outlets still report the size of the American economy is the largest, using the measurement of market exchange rates rather than PPP. And I've had big arguments about the book where I say the people who've tried best to compare national economies have concluded that the best yardstick, not the only one, you should have 20 yardsticks, but the best yardstick is purchasing power parity. And by that yardstick, China became the largest economy in the world in 2014. So if you go to the CIA website, or if you go to the IMF website, and look at how large the economies are, China's economy is 10% larger than the US today. No, that can't be. Well, of course it can be. So I think forcing ourselves to look at the facts, uncomfortable facts, because I don't like it. I would like us to be the biggest economy. I like us to be the strongest. Mm-hmm. So the idea that there might be some other country that's as big and strong as the U.S., no, that's not supposed to be. But I say, life is what it is, and we have to adjust to it. And actually, the opportunities are as great as the, once you get over the grief, the opportunities are significant. Yeah.
So we have some really terrific questions. Every one of them is great. But before that, I want to say that you're listening to the Commonwealth Club of California's program, and we are discussing relations between China and the United States. Our guest is Graham Allison, distinguished Harvard professor and former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense, who is discussing his concerns about the real possibility of a looming military conflict between the United States and China. I'm Ellen Tauscher, your moderator, and you can hear Commonwealth Club programs on the radio, catch up with the program videos on the club's YouTube channel, and visit us on Facebook and Twitter. So, how about this for a first question? Doesn't the nuclear age undermine the notion of the trap?
Good question, and especially with Ellen here, who's spent a lot of time, not only when she was in Congress, but as the Undersecretary, in making us safer in the nuclear domain. So yes, indeed, the nuclear underpinning of this is fundamental. And as I said, one of the areas where we should remember every day, every instant, that we have a vital shared national interest, in the sense that if we fail on this score, we might kill everybody. So, bad idea. So yes, this makes a huge, huge, huge difference. On the other hand, I wrote a book, my first book ever, was about the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's 1962. Mm-hmm. In that case, President John F. Kennedy ran what he thought was a 1 in 3 chance of nuclear war. So we're already there. Took a 1 in 3 chance of nuclear war to prevent the Soviet Union installing nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba. So if the 1/3 had shown up rather than the 2/3, we would not be able to say, well, of course, there were nuclear weapons and therefore wars didn't occur. So the fact that a nuclear war would be so devastating has a very salutary, cautionary consequence for sane people. You look and say, I better be careful. Even I better adjust my behavior, because if you're my Siamese twin, I just can't, if I batter you to the point of death, I die. So no, this is a bad idea. On the other hand, can I take risks of that happening, figuring that you're calculating the same thing I'm calculating,
Right.
and therefore I want you to change your behavior, because otherwise I think that's unacceptable for me. Yes, I can. So can I imagine what's happening currently right on the Korean Peninsula? I can. And can I imagine that being, in effect, a Cuban Missile Crisis in slow motion? I can. And if it ended up that it was in a war, we would say, this is crazy, but I would say also, this is life. Yeah.
So talk a little bit about the notion that President Trump has expected that the Chinese can be cajoled into managing, almost like outsourcing, the CEO outsourcing a job to somebody, managing the North Korean situation for us, that we can just ask the Chinese nicely, please take care of this. What exactly what is the trap there, and what would you recommend that we do?
Okay, so great question. So just to put us in the picture so everybody's on the same page. So at the Mar-a-Lago summit a month ago between President Trump and China's President Xi Jinping, President Trump said to him, you can solve this problem, you, China, Mr. Xi Jinping. But if you don't solve this problem, I will solve this problem, and you won't like the way that I do it. And then this was at dinner, he served chocolate cake. A big
piece of chocolate cake.
He excused himself and went out and announced that we were conducting cruise missile strikes on Syria, in case you missed the point. Okay? So what's happening in the North Korean case is you should think of it like a Cuban Missile Crisis in slow motion. So down one train track is coming Mr. Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea. He has tested nuclear weapons and built nuclear weapons and has 25 nuclear weapons. That's crazy. He shouldn't be able to, but he does.
He's an outlaw.
He's tested and deployed short-range missiles that can deliver these nuclear warheads against South Korea. He shouldn't, but he did. He's tested and deployed medium-range missiles that can deliver these nuclear warheads against Japan. Well, this is nuts. This guy, who's a weird, strange person, able to attack Japan with nuclear weapons? Yes, that's today. And he's about to conduct tests of ICBMs in the next months, not forever, but in the next months, before the end of the year, that will allow him to deliver a nuclear warhead against San Francisco. So that's coming down the track. Trump has heard of this. The first time he heard of it was from President Obama. After he was elected, they have a meeting between the president-elect and the president. And Obama said to him, there's this brewing crisis on the Korean Peninsula. Trump said, I never heard of this. Okay? I mean, most Americans haven't heard of this. It's too weird to believe, okay? This guy is going to acquire the ability to strike San Francisco with a nuclear weapon? No, forget about it. So Trump went out immediately from the meeting and tweeted, and then the next hour, not going to happen. He said, this is the kind of thing that happened under Obama. He just let the thing happen. And under Bush, he just let this happen. And Clinton, he just let, but not under me. I'm telling you, this is not going to happen. And every day thereafter, when he's given a chance to talk about it, he said, I'm telling you, this is not going to happen. So he has a capacity to prevent it from happening by striking North Korea. And I think he might strike North Korea. But I think if he does strike North Korea, then that's maybe not the end of the game. So whenever we've looked at this before, North Korea then retaliates against Seoul. Maybe kills 1 million people in the first 24 or 48 hours.
And we have 38,000 American troops in the
Absolutely.
Republic of Korea.
And then what happens? So let's imagine in Seoul 1 million people have been killed. Well, then probably the US and South Korea attack all the other missiles and artillery that could kill another 10 million people. So now we go after a couple of thousand targets. And the US has a fantastic military establishment that can basically destroy any target we can find. But the question is, do we know where all the targets are? Probably not. And in the course of attacking them, do some of them then probably launch against South Korea? Maybe even a nuclear weapon? Maybe. So you look and you think, this is insane. I mean, absolutely insane. And could this ultimately, in that the Americans and Chinese are fighting each other? For those of you that don't remember, go back and try to look and see what happened in the Korean War.
Right.
We already saw this movie. It was not a very good movie. So,
Well, actually, they're still at war. It's
yes,
an
they
armistice.
are. They are.
Not even, there's not even
They only have an armistice. But in the first Korean War, North Korea attacked South Korea, almost took the whole country. U.S. came to the rescue just the very last minute. MacArthur, who was in Japan, as the leader of the troops, marches rapidly up the peninsula. He thinks he's going to reunify the country and the troops are going to be home for Christmas. All of a sudden, out of the blue, as we're approaching the border with China, the Chinese attack the U.S. Who could imagine they would attack the U.S.? This is 5 years after World War II. We had just dropped 2 atomic bombs next door to finish this war. We're the only country in the world that has nuclear weapons. Somebody attacks us? Never. Forget about it. They did, and they actually beat us right back down the peninsula to the 38th parallel, where the matter ended. So I would say China is not prepared to have a unified Korea that's a military ally of the U.S. They've demonstrated that before, and that's what they tell us now. So, but would they have a war with us over this? Well, I hope not. I wouldn't have thought they would have attacked us in 1950, but they did, yeah.
So what are China's main military vulnerabilities, geographical, strategic, and technological?
Oh, that's a good question. So China is clearly militarily inferior to the U.S. U.S. military establishment is the greatest military establishment in the world. We spend way more money than everybody else combined on our military establishment, so it should be. We have a lot of training because we've been fighting for a long time, now virtually for the last 15 years in Afghanistan and in Iraq and others. And China, U.S. nuclear arsenal is much larger than China's. On the other hand, our advantage is not so large that we can disarm them. So if we do our best in the first strike against China, they still have enough nuclear weapons to kill most of us. So that's back to mutual assured destruction. So that's a bad idea. Okay? So now, for global, China does not have global reach. The U.S. can send troops anywhere, anytime, and we go around bombing people here, there, wherever, especially in the Middle East. China doesn't do that. But in the region, which is where China lives, say in the South China Sea or in the East China Sea, China has a huge advantage because it's right on their border. So we have to try to support the U.S. Navy and aircraft out there and a couple of bases in Guam or in Japan or in South Korea. China is just operating from home. So we have a carrier that's out in the South China Sea that costs billions of dollars. China has on its land a missile that costs $1 million that can attack the carrier. Well, that's not a game that you want to play. So I'd say the regional military balance has been changing steadily in China's favor. In 1996, when there was the Taiwan crisis, I was at the Pentagon at the time as an assistant secretary. Basically, President Clinton sent a couple of carriers into the area to prevent China intimidating Taiwan. This humiliated the Chinese military, and every day thereafter, they've been working to deny us the capability to do that again. And they've succeeded, yeah.
Right. That's right. So there are many things that cause war, but war is definitely a failure of diplomacy. What is your comment on the state of the State Department and the use or non-use of diplomacy now?
Now that's a great question, and I would say diplomacy and statecraft. And the U.S. has shown itself capable on occasions of brilliant statecraft. And I would say the statecraft led by the Department of State and the Secretary of State, John Kerry, but under the leadership of President Obama, and with the great cooperation of the Secretary of Energy, Secretary Ernie Moniz, somebody that Ellen and I both are big fans of, and actually the hard work of Wendy Sherman, who was the Undersecretary for Policy, who spent most of the time there slugging away with the Iranians, reached an agreement with Iran, which is an ugly deal, and which is not perfect, but which basically halted Iran's nuclear advance for at least a decade and probably much longer, which if they had not succeeded in doing in 2015, we would either now have a nuclear-armed Iran or we would have attacked Iran and have a war. Those are the two choices. So I would say, how did this happen? A Secretary of State, a Secretary of the Energy, a President, a Undersecretary for Policy, they slugged away diplomacy, statecraft, great success. If I go back to the Cold War, I mean, I have a good chapter in this discussing the Cold War, which is one of the cases of success. The surging Soviet Union, the U.S. met with a strategy, a rather amazing strategy, a wild strategy, one that was almost unimaginable before, that was a competition with the Soviet Union in every dimension except bombs and bullets killing each other. So we fought with them covertly, we fought them in an information war, an economic war, we fought with allies, but we did not fight with bombs and bullets. So that goes in my no war column. I count that war, when you call it Cold War, is like metaphor. It's not real war, okay? So where did that come from? Well, there was a guy, George Kennan. He was the #2 person in the State Department embassy in Moscow, who figured out what was happening in the Soviet Union. He wrote a note back to a guy who was the Secretary of State. That was George Marshall, under President Truman. You had a great Republican leader of the Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Vandenberg. You had Paul Nitze was working in the policy planning office at the State Department. So basically, the role that diplomacy and statecraft play in either allowing us to deal with problems or failing to deal with the problems is absolutely central, and therefore one of the sillinesses in the announced budget that says, well, we don't really care about the State Department, we'll cut 1/3 of its budget, and we don't even care about appointing people in the State Department. I mean, I have a number of friends.
No one home.
Yeah, you go, they say,
No deputy.
There's nobody here, yeah.
There are 6 undersecretaries, none have been appointed. There are lots of
There's
assistant
nobody in your
secretaries.
job, yeah. There's nobody in the.
There's nobody in any of the
deputy's job. I mean, I think Secretary Tillerson actually, I think was a great choice. I think he's going to do a good job. I think he's a thoughtful international person, but I think that idea that he can do this all by himself. I mean,
Right.
Hillary Clinton was a great Secretary of State, but she had Ellen Tauscher and a bunch of other people there. Yeah.
Well, there's nobody in the embassies either. I mean, normally when there's a transition between governments, the top 25 countries, Japan, France, the UK, Russia, those ambassadors, whether they're foreign service officers or political appointees, are asked to stay until the new administration comes in, they get their cabinet nominated and confirmed, and then they go to the next tranche, which are the big ambassadors. And they appoint them, and once those people are appointed, Graham's sitting in Moscow waiting for someone to be appointed. They appoint them, they confirm them, Graham comes home, the new person comes in. President Trump recalled all the ambassadors. We don't have anybody. We have a couple of places, Poland, I was there last week, we have an ambassador there, a great foreign service officer. I'm not really worried about Poland, by the way. It's a great place. But, it's not like, Carolyn Kennedy came home. Think about it. These are places where we have terrific ally relationships, real important business to be done. These are friends of ours that influence not only themselves and their people and their parliaments, but the neighborhood. And nobody's home. And I heard on the TV yesterday, the font of all knowledge, the television, of the 1,200 appointments that the president is meant to make for the executive branch and for the different cabinet agencies, they've made 43.
Oh, no.
That's not even a good start if
No.
you think about how many you have to do if at this pace just to get them confirmed and things.
But just as a footnote, 'cause I agree 100% with Ellen, but the whole process for confirmation and otherwise
Oh, it's crazy.
is broken.
It is.
I mean, way before President Trump came to town. I mean,
You have to plead guilty in order to do something.
Absolutely. I had to plead guilty to 99 crimes, only a few of which I had committed. And
Well,
you
it's
have
a
to
self-fulfilling
humiliate
prophecy.
yourself
We're not
and
gonna get
whatever.
people
So
to agree.
It goes for a long, long time, and it's way extended. But the idea that you don't get people going down the track, because
Right.
you need people in these jobs. There's a lot of work to do. Yeah.
Speaking of Vladimir Putin, how does the Russia-U.S. situation impact our relations with China?
Okay, that's a good question. Well, I'm not going to go off on RussiaGate because that would take us separately.
That's a long
separate
tangent.
topic and a long. But I think it's a good question because the general perception in the U.S. that's magnified even by the media, I think, is largely wrong about Russia and its relationship with China. So the general American narrative says Russia and China can't have a good relationship because they share such a long border. Half of Russia is uninhabited, Siberia. The Chinese have an excess of people. There's a lot of resources in Siberia. So over time, the Chinese are going to be interested in that territory. And I would say in the long run, that's not a bad idea. I mean, in the long run, I wouldn't bet on this relationship being comfortable. But in the short run, like this year and next year and the next, as far as you can see, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are best buddies. So this relationship is very thick. The first trip that Xi Jinping made when he became president was to Moscow.
Yep.
Every event that President Xi Jinping has, Putin is there. Last week, that One Belt, One Road event, Xi gave the first big speech. Who spoke second? Putin. Putin and Xi Jinping get together. What do they talk about? First, they talk about their problem. What is the problem? The U.S.
So the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Exactly.
So this is more about, so it's always about us.
Yes. Well, I would say partly it's about they feel comfortable with each other because they're both authoritarian leaders and they're trying to lead systems. Part of what they find uncomfortable with us is that we try, they think, to undermine them because we say democracies are a preferred form of government and that running an autocracy in which you lock up people who don't agree with you is bad. That's what we think as Americans. They think that's good. That's how they stay in power. So,
So this is a good question. I was surprised to learn the Paris Climate Accord is a treaty that was never confirmed by the Senate as required by the Constitution. Our compliance with it was merely done by Obama's executive order. What can you expect other than the incoming administration to cancel it? Well, actually, the reason it's called the Paris Climate Accord is because it's not a treaty. It was an accord. So it didn't need to be confirmed by the Senate. So there was no constitutional requirement there. And our compliance with it was our own deal. Everybody had their own deal. We had our own deal. But it was actually an agreement where we agreed to agree, and we agreed to have certain caps and certain deliverables, but it was not enforceable. And that was the critique of the accord. What do you think about the circumstances that we find ourselves in?
Okay, so I think the question is a good question, and I think Ellen's explanation of it, I agree with entirely, because it needs to be clarified. So the Paris Accord was not very good. Like the Iran agreement is not very good.
Well, most agreements among 5, 10, 20 people
Exactly.
get watered down.
Question
Nobody
is
gets what they want.
Question is compared to the alternative, okay? Compared to the alternative. Right? With my Israeli friends, we've had a lot of argument about the Iranian deal. They say, I can imagine a better Iranian deal. I say, I can imagine a better Iranian deal. Secretary Kerry can imagine a better Iranian deal. But if you have an agreement between two parties, sometimes each doesn't get everything. So an agreement usually requires me to give something to get something. So in the climate accord, yes, of course, it would be better to have an enforceable treaty, and yes, it would be better to have a much more advanced and much more demanding agenda, I think. But what was important about the Paris Accord was that all the parties came together and agreed, we have a problem. We have a big problem. We're all emitting greenhouse gases, and we're going to make a climate that's uninhabitable. And this is unsustainable. So this is unacceptable. I mean, otherwise, unless we say we have no responsibility for future generations, this makes no sense. So parties said, okay, we accept that we have a problem, and we accept that we all have to do something about it. And now we're going to start, not we're going to finish, we're going to start, and we have a set of commitments, and we have some process and conversation about whether and how we fulfill the commitments. And then the other part of the Paris Accord, which was not as well known, but which is, I think, equally, maybe more important, a group of billionaires led by Bill Gates and governments agreed that they're going to put $30 billion into developing new technologies that would make it'd be possible to be more ambitious in this space. Well, the idea that we then say, well, we just walk away from this. I do try to give President Trump the benefit of the doubt. He's our president. We live in a dangerous world. I hope and pray that he does a good job for all of us. It's necessary that he does. But I think in this case, my one line on it was from Napoleon. He said about an event, he said, this is worse than a crime. This is a blunder. Yeah.
So it was my experience when I was undersecretary that when the P5, which are the UK, France, the United States, Russia, and China, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the nuclear weapon states, obviously there were more now, but we're the 5. When we wanted to do something, I would go, I'd leave my house, I'd go up the street to the British Embassy, I'd get on a video teleconference, classified, talk to the British, have a nice little conversation. 2 minutes later, we'd agree. One of us would agree to go get the French. We'd get them a few days later. Then we'd go get the Russians. That would take weeks and sometimes months. And then we would get the Russians, and then we'd send the Russians to get the Chinese. And that was the way it always happened. It's kind of, the way we did it. We have now, I think, a different set of circumstances. Going to get the Russians isn't so easy. We still need them, and it's tougher to get the Chinese without the Russians, because they do have this agreement to work together. What does the world look like with a dominant China? People do expect that they can dial 911 and the U.S. will come. They think that, there's a storm that knocks over the Bengali Straits, 10,000 people get washed away. There's some bad thing that happens someplace that the United States is going to come. China, not so much, not so known for doing that. What happens with a rising China that doesn't have the same sense of responsibilities that we took on as the big superpower? And what does that mean for the world community in the next 10 or 15 years?
That's an extremely good question, and I think that
Here.
you're absolutely right that the Chinese conception of their role in the world does not include benevolence. I mean, the Chinese are usually pretty straightforward about what's good for us is what we're interested in. And while the Americans often exaggerate our role as Madeleine Albright once called the benevolent hegemon,
The indispensable country.
the indispensable, but also the benevolent hegemon, as if we're benevolent. The answer is, compared to the alternative, this is going to look pretty good. Okay? So, yes, the U.S. makes exceptions for the rules for ourselves when we really, really, really want to. So we did not get the permission from anybody to go topple Saddam. The president decides he wants to do that, he does. We didn't get permission from anybody to go topple Gaddafi. I mean, we got a UN resolution that said we could protect some people for humanitarian purposes, but then we went off and killed Gaddafi. Okay, then nobody told us that was okay. We don't, and no president would get up and say, "I need to ask permission." You know, we're the USA. We do what we do. On the other hand, if you look, I think at the world of the last 7 decades, which is a fantastic world without any great power war for 7 decades. Historically, a great anomaly. This is very substantially as a result of an order that the U.S. has built and maintained. And I think if and as that unravels, which we can see it unraveling in part because of the Thucydidean dynamic with China, but also in this case, to some extent, because we're retreating from various fields and just leaving them fallow. I think this is going to be a much more dangerous world.
So, when or should the United States gracefully acknowledge China's rise in supremacy?
When or how?
Yeah, when or should, and what would that look like?
Well, I would say, I mean, for sure we should not deny facts. So part of this book I say, you know, we play too often let's pretend, in which we just refuse to see things that we don't like. Well, I think that's always a foolish policy. But I think recognizing that China has risen so meteorically over this period of time, and that there are many very positive aspects of it. Look, 600 million people who used to be miserably poor are now not. This is the biggest successful anti-poverty program ever conceived. This is what accounts for the success of the millennial goals. So these guys have done this themselves. In fact, as China has become wealthier, its relationship with the U.S. has been beneficial for us. Part of the things that kept prices down is the ability to trade, to take advantage of Chinese. So there are a lot of elements of this, and I would think that back to the point that you quoted earlier, we should start by saying what is vital for the U.S., and then what are other things that matter but are only vivid. They look very big. Everybody should get attention. They're not vital. And then we can adapt and adjust. So is it essential that the U.S. have a strong view about who owns each island in the South China Sea? I mean, not for me, okay? How much should we care about somebody who wants to build a few more islands in the South China Sea? I would say I would prefer they didn't, but it's not something I want to fight about. On the other hand, do we want to find a way that China and the U.S. could work together to somehow prevent North Korea from becoming a trigger that drags the two of us into a war that we will? Of course we do. So I think if we think about the common interests that we talked about before, and then we look at the competing interests, it ought to be possible for as far as we can see to adapt and adjust in ways that wouldn't cause, it may cause a little bit of heartburn, especially for people that are attached to the status quo in this area or that. But the life changes, world changes, and I would say we can adapt successfully.
So we have one last question. We only have about a minute left, but in the law of unintended consequences, it didn't miss Kim Jong-un that Saddam Hussein didn't have weapons of mass destruction. We knocked him off. Libya, Gaddafi gave away a bunch of his chemical weapons and stuff. We knocked him off. So apparently, Kim Jong-un has decided that he needs a nuclear weapon to differentiate himself from the guys that we knock off, and make us think about it twice. What do you think?
I think you're exactly right. Again, one of the points, and Ellen always says exactly how she sees it, which I think is the right thing to do. We like to say what we did in Iraq is no precedent. To which answer, you can declare that something's not a precedent, but excuse me, I saw you did it. And what we did to Gaddafi, that's no precedent. That has nothing to do with you, Mr. Kim Jong-un. And he looks and he thinks, wait a minute. Eric Edelman, who was George W. Bush's Undersecretary for Policy at Defense, announced this, and I always call it the Edelman rule. He said, well, look at the lesson we've taught other people. If you have no nuclear weapons at all, like Saddam, we will invade you. But if you have nuclear weapons and you give them up, we will only bomb you, like Libya.
Right.
So from Kim Jong-un, he's thinking, I need some insurance. This looks to me like my security blanket. So I think from his point of view, he thinks having nuclear weapons would be a good idea. I think actually Iran thinks from its point of view, having nuclear weapons would be a good idea. But our job is not what's good for him. Our job is what's good for us. So we have to say, even with all the circumstances, even with actions that we've taken otherwise, how do we prevent people doing things that they may want to do that would be very bad for us? And I think him being able to attack San Francisco is one of those things. Yeah.
Well, that was a fast 65 minutes. I have to say, it's a terrific book. I recommend it to everyone. Our thanks to Dr. Graham Allison, former Assistant Secretary of Defense, Director of Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and author of the new book, Destined for War: Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? Homer's Trap. We also want to thank everyone here, as well as our audience on radio, television, and the internet. Tonight's program has been held in association with the Committee of 100. Thank you. We also want to remind everyone that there are copies of Graham Allison's book on sale, and he'll be pleased to sign copies very quickly following the program. I'm Ellen Tauscher, and now this meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California, the place where you're in the know, is adjourned.